Okay, so you want to own a supermarket. Find a building, stock the shelves, watch the carts roll through the checkout lanes. Thousands of customers a week, hundreds of dollars a cart, money pouring in from the moment the automatic doors slide open. Sounds like one of the safest businesses in the world. Food is the one thing people can never stop buying. Well, almost walk into any American or British supermarket, and the first thing your brain registers is abundance. Wide aisles, bright lighting, somewhere between 30 and 40,000 individual products sitting on the shelves, more variety under one roof than most towns had in total 100 years ago. The checkout lanes never really stop moving, and the revenue numbers back up that feeling of wealth. The average American supermarket brings in somewhere around $712,000 a week. Multiply that across a year, and a single store is pulling in close to $37 million in gross sales. $37 million from one building in one town. Here's the problem. Almost none of that money stays in the building. Supermarkets are not high-margin businesses. They never have been. They are high-volume machines that survive on fractions of a cent. The industry average net profit margin sits somewhere between 1 and 3%, and in the most recent full year of data, food retailers averaged about 1.7% net profit. Run the math on that $37 million in revenue, and the store keeps around $629,000 a year. When a customer spends $100 at the register, the owner of that store walks away with less than $2 of it. Everyone else in the transaction, the farmer, the distributor, the trucking company, the manufacturer, the landlord, the electric company, the employees, takes the rest. So before you even think about buying a grocery store, you need to throw out the mental model you walked in with. This is not a markup business. Nobody gets rich charging a 50% premium on a can of soup. This is a logistics business wearing a retail costume. The real skill is moving enormous volumes of perishable, fragile, low-margin goods through a building faster than they spoil, faster than they get stolen, and faster than a competitor down the street can undercut you. Understand that, and everything else about this business starts to make sense. Let's start with what it actually costs to get in the door. There is no single price tag on a supermarket. There's a ladder of options, and the cheap end of that ladder is mostly a trap. At the very bottom, you could open a small corner grocery store for around $100,000. That gets you a tiny footprint, a handful of coolers, and barely enough inventory to look like a real store. It is not what most people picture when they say the word supermarket, and it will not generate anywhere near supermarket-level revenue. To build a genuine, full-scale independent supermarket, one with a produce section, a butcher counter, a bakery, and enough parking to matter, you are looking at somewhere between $3.5 million and $16 million, depending entirely on your location. And location is where the first hidden cost ambushes you. Commercial retail rent in an average American shopping center runs close to $24 per square foot per year. In a prime coastal market, that number can climb past $60 per square foot. The average supermarket footprint is about 42,000 square feet. Do that multiplication in your head, and you already understand why so many grocery chains fight so hard over real estate before they've sold a single item. Then comes the build-out. And this is where the real money disappears. Land, construction, and the physical shell of the store can run anywhere from $400,000 for a small conversion to $15 million for a ground-up build in an expensive market. Refrigeration alone, the walk-in coolers, the compressors, the open-air display cases for meat and dairy and frozen goods, typically costs between $250,000 and $750,000, and that number climbs fast in a larger store. A single 20-foot by 20-foot commercial walk-in cooler can run past $25,000 on its own, and a full supermarket needs several of them, each holding a different temperature zone. Then you need something to put inside all that refrigeration. Initial inventory to fill the shelves and make the store look complete on opening day costs somewhere between $200,000 and $500,000. Shelving and fixtures, the gondola racks, the produce displays, bakery and deli counters run $50,000 to $150,000. Technology, security cameras, point-of-sale terminals, electronic systems, another $30,000 to $120,000. Shopping carts alone can cost $15,000 to $40,000 for a full fleet, and that's before you add pallet jacks, balers, and backroom equipment. And then there's the cost nobody warns you about before you sign anything, the liquor license. In states where licenses are capped by population, the market price for the right to sell alcohol in your store can range from $15,000 in a quiet rural county to well over $400,000 in a competitive city market. Alcohol is one of the highest margin categories in the entire store, which is exactly why the right to sell it costs so much. Skip it, and you've cut off one of your best profit centers before you've even opened. Add it all up, and a serious, full-format supermarket is a multi-million-dollar commitment before a single customer has walked through the door. That's the entry cost. Now let's talk about what it costs just to keep the lights on. The cost of goods sold, what you pay wholesale for the products sitting on your shelves, eats up somewhere between 65 and 75% of every dollar in sales. That's before a single other expense. What's left has to cover everything else the business needs to survive. First, labor. Wages and benefits typically run 10 to 16.3% of total sales, and this is where supermarkets quietly bleed money that most owners underestimate. The retail grocery industry has one of the highest staff turnover rates in the entire economy, around 40% annually for part-time workers, climbing close to 56% at companies running multiple locations. Every time an employee leaves, you're paying to recruit, hire, and retrain a replacement, and that cycle never really stops. Second, energy. Supermarkets are among the most electricity-hungry commercial buildings that exist, largely because of refrigeration running 24 hours a day every day of the year. A typical store consumes around 51 kilowatt hours of electricity per square foot annually. For a 40,000 square foot store, that works out to roughly $230,000 a year just in utility bills, and refrigeration plus lighting alone can account for 50 to 80% of that total. Third, rent and occupancy, typically 4 to 10% of revenue. Fourth, everything else, marketing, insurance, maintenance, security, and technology licensing, which together add another 3 to 8%. And then there's the cost that never shows up on an invoice, shrinkage. This is the industry's word for inventory that simply disappears, through theft, spoilage, or error, before it's ever sold. Total shrinkage across the grocery sector averages between 1.6 and 3% of sales. That might sound small, but remember the net margin is only 1.7%. A 2% shrink rate in a business running a 1.7% profit margin isn't a rounding error. It's the difference between a profitable year and a loss. Break that shrinkage down and the picture gets uncomfortable. Employee theft, from cash skimming to giving free items to friends, accounts for roughly 42% of all shrink losses, and the average internal incident costs a store close to $1,900. Shoplifting accounts for another 37%, though the average external theft incident is smaller, around $461. The rest comes from administrative mistakes and vendor errors. Mispriced items, scanning mistakes, short shipments from suppliers. On top of theft, there's spoilage, which hits the fresh departments especially hard. Fresh produce alone loses an average of 11.6% of stock to spoilage, and some highly perishable greens can see loss rates above 60%. Across the country, supermarkets throw away an estimated $15 billion worth of unsold fruit and vegetables every single year. Multiply the math out, and a single $100 inventory loss requires the store to generate over $5,000 in brand new sales just to break even on that mistake. Because the profit margin on each new dollar of sales is so thin so far, the picture looks brutal. Now let's talk about how the money actually gets made. Because there is a real working system underneath all of this, the center aisles of the store, the canned goods, the cereal, the bottled drinks, are essentially loss leaders. They exist to get people in the building and keep them coming back weekly, but the margins there are thin, often around 26% gross, before any operating costs are subtracted. The real profit lives on the perimeter of the store. Fresh produce carries a gross margin around 30 to 40%, despite the spoilage risk. The deli and prepared foods counter runs even higher, 40 to over 50% gross margin, because customers are paying for convenience, not just ingredients. The in-store bakery is often the single most profitable department in the entire building, with margins routinely exceeding 55%, because flour, sugar, and yeast are cheap, and the finished product looks and smells like something worth paying a premium for. Meat and seafood run 25 to 30%. And floral, despite taking up barely more than 1% of the store's total footprint, generates gross margin around 46%, making it one of the best uses of square footage in the whole building. Then there's the quiet war between national brands and private label goods. National brands like the big soda companies or the big cereal companies draw customers into the store because people already know and trust them, but because those manufacturers hold all the negotiating power, they leave the retailer with only about 26% gross margin. Private label, the store's own branded version of the same product, flips that equation. By cutting out the manufacturer's marketing budget and negotiating direct production deals, a store can build its own products for 40 to 50% less than what it costs to stock the national brand, price the private label item 20 to 30% below the branded version, and still walk away with a gross margin closer to 35%. The sweet spot most successful supermarkets land on is having private label make up somewhere between 35 and 40% of total products. Push much higher than that and customers start feeling like their choices are being taken away. Sit much lower and you're leaving margin on the table every single day. There's also a financial mechanism working quietly in the background that most customers never think about, called the cash conversion cycle. Because customers pay cash or card instantly, and because grocery inventory turns over fast, a supermarket usually collects its money from a sale within a day or two. But suppliers, especially large national manufacturers, are often paid on 30, 60, or even 90-day terms. That gap means the store is sitting on the supplier's money for weeks before it has to pay the bill. Multiply that across an entire store's worth of inventory, and a well-run supermarket effectively gets free, interest-free financing every single month, funded entirely by its own suppliers. Here's where it gets interesting. On paper, 1.7% looks like an almost embarrassingly small profit margin. But that number is deceptive because it isn't applied once. A successful independent grocery store turns its entire inventory over somewhere between 17 and 19 times a year. That same 1.7% margin, applied to the same dollar of capital 19 separate times over 12 months, compounds into a return that looks nothing like 1.7% by the time the year ends. This is the entire logic behind everyday low pricing. Keep the markup small, keep the shelves moving, and let volume do what markup alone never could. And volume is not an accident. It is engineered deliberately down to the inch of floor space. The first several feet inside the entrance are what the industry calls the decompression zone, a deliberately uncluttered area, often filled with bright produce or flowers, designed to signal freshness before the customer has picked up a single item. Roughly 9 out of 10 shoppers naturally drift to the right when they enter a store. So stores are laid out to guide traffic in a counterclockwise loop because data shows counterclockwise shoppers spend a couple of dollars more per visit than shoppers who move the other way. The absolute essentials, milk, eggs, bread, basic meat, sit at the very back and around the far edge of the store, forcing every customer to walk past thousands of higher margin items just to reach the things they came in for. Eye level is buy level. Products placed at a standard adult's eye line sell dramatically faster than identical products placed above or below, which is exactly why manufacturers pay real money, sometimes several hundred to over $1,000 per item per store, just to secure that shelf position. Lower shelves, meanwhile, are strategically loaded with bright, sugary products, angled toward the eye line of a small child sitting in the cart, not the adult pushing it. End cap displays, the promotional shelving at the end of each aisle, reliably boost sales of the featured item by 20 to 30% during a promotion. And the checkout lane, where the customer is standing still with nothing to do but wait, is lined with candy, gum, and cold drinks, converting a few idle minutes into pure, high-margin impulse revenue. None of this is guesswork. It is one of the most heavily researched areas of retail psychology in existence because the margins are so thin that even a small shift in customer behavior can be the difference between a profitable quarter and a loss. Now remember what I said about the volatility built into every part of this business. The costs are fixed. Rent doesn't change month to month. Refrigeration runs whether the store is busy or empty. But the revenue side is exposed to forces far outside the owner's control, and this is where a lot of supermarkets quietly bleed to death. Take online delivery. A typical $100 basket bought in-store generates roughly $4 of net profit for the store. Take that exact same order online, and now an employee has to walk the aisles, hand-pick each item, pack it, and either hand it off or personally deliver it. By the time labor and logistics costs are added, that same order can flip from a $4 profit into a $13 loss. Every grocery chain in the country is currently wrestling with this exact math, because customers want the convenience, but very few are willing to pay what that convenience actually costs to deliver. Take out-of-stock shelves. When a customer reaches for a product that isn't there, over 60% will settle for a substitute, but up to 25% will simply walk away without buying anything. And in categories where brand loyalty runs strong, over 40% will leave the store entirely and buy it somewhere else. Stockouts alone are estimated to cost retailers around 4.1% of total sales, a devastating number in a business running on a 1.7% margin. And here's the part that stings. The vast majority of stockouts, somewhere between 70 and 90%, aren't caused by suppliers failing to deliver. They're caused by internal failures. Employees not restocking the shelf fast enough. Take inflation. When wholesale prices rise and a store passes that cost onto the shelf price, customers don't just grumble and pay it. They trade down, They switch from the national brand to the private label. They abandon premium items entirely. Some walk out the door for good and start shopping at a discount chain instead. The grocery customer is famously price sensitive because food spending is one of the most closely tracked line items in almost every household budget. Add labor shortages to that list. With part-time turnover regularly above 40%, a store is almost never operating with a fully trained, fully staffed team, which means the very people responsible for restocking shelves and preventing spoilage are often the newest, least experienced hands in the building. Add a food safety recall, an event no single store can control or predict, and a supermarket can lose an entire category of revenue overnight while absorbing the reputational damage that follows a customer's trust being broken. Add a supply chain disruption, a port delay, a trucking shortage, a severe weather event, and the tightly timed inventory system that keeps a store's costs low suddenly produces empty shelves instead, at exactly the moment competitors down the street still have stock. This is the structural trap of the entire industry. The store's costs behave like a business with predictable fixed obligations. The store's revenue behaves like a business exposed to consumer psychology, competitor pricing, and macroeconomic swings the owner has zero control over. That mismatch is exactly why so many grocery chains, even massive, well-run ones with decades of experience, eventually collapse, and the volatility doesn't stop with customer behavior. It extends to the entire competitive landscape sitting around every independent grocery store. Walmart leans on sheer global scale to dictate everyday low pricing across the whole industry. Costco has built an entirely different model around bulk purchasing and a membership fee that renews at close to 90% every single year, meaning over half of the company's operating profit doesn't come from selling groceries at all. It comes from the membership card sitting in your wallet. Hard discount chains like Aldi and Lidl strip out almost everything a traditional supermarket considers standard, carrying only around 700 to 1,500 products instead of 30,000, running stores with as few as 3 to 7 employees on shift, and using that stripped-down cost structure to undercut traditional grocery prices by 15 to 30%. An independent supermarket cannot win a straight price war against any of these companies. Studies comparing shopping baskets consistently show Aldi and Lidl pricing 30 to 40% below traditional regional supermarkets, and warehouse clubs like Costco coming roughly 21% cheaper than Walmart on a per-unit basis. So the smaller operators that survive don't try to win on price. They win by moving fast, stocking hyper-local and specialty items that a national chain's rigid supply chain will never bother carrying, and building the kind of in-person relationship with regular customers that a self-checkout kiosk simply cannot replicate. Technology has become the newest front in this fight, and it's reshaping the economics of the store in real time. Electronic shelf labels, small digital price tags using e-ink displays, cost somewhere between $5 and $15 per unit, meaning a full store rollout can run past $100,000. That sounds like an enormous expense for something as simple as a price tag, until you consider what it replaces. Hundreds of labor hours a week spent printing and manually swapping paper tags, and the pricing errors that come with doing it by hand. More importantly, digital tags let a store change prices instantly across the entire building, dropping the price on produce that's about to expire before it has to be thrown away, or matching a competitor's promotion in real time instead of waiting for the next print cycle. Artificial intelligence is now doing a version of the same job for inventory. Predictive software watches sales patterns, anticipates seasonal shifts, and automatically triggers reorders before a shelf actually goes empty, directly attacking that stockout problem that costs the industry so heavily every year. Self-checkout lanes reduce the labor cost of the single most repetitive job in the building. And behind the scenes, some of the largest chains are now building automated micro-fulfillment centers, essentially small robotic warehouses attached to the back of a physical store that can pick and pack an online grocery order roughly 5 times faster than a human employee walking the aisles, directly targeting that painful gap between in-store profit and online loss. None of this technology is optional anymore. It's a defensive investment made specifically to protect a margin that was already razor-thin before Walmart, Aldi, and online delivery ever entered the picture. For chains that do manage to grow past a single location, the path forward almost always runs through vertical integration, cutting out a middleman supplier entirely and controlling a piece of the supply chain directly. The clearest modern example of this is Costco's rotisserie chicken. For years, Costco sold a whole rotisserie chicken for $4.99, a price that hadn't moved despite rising poultry costs because that chicken functioned as a loss leader, a product priced specifically to pull customers through the door even if it barely broke even on its own. As wholesale chicken supply tightened and threatened that price point, Costco made an extraordinary decision. Instead of raising the price or accepting a worse deal from the existing poultry suppliers, the company built its own $450 million poultry complex in Fremont, Nebraska, contracting directly with more than 100 local farmers and operating its own hatchery, feed mill, and processing plant. The result was direct control over the production of roughly 100 million chickens a year, covering about 40% of the company's total domestic need and savings estimated between 10 and 35 cents per bird. It's a striking example of how far a retailer will go to protect a single iconic low-margin product because that product's real value isn't the $4.99 it generates directly. Its real value is the number of customers it pulls through the door every week. Most independent grocers will never build their own poultry farm, but the underlying lesson scales down perfectly. Whether it's a regional chain negotiating direct contracts with local produce farms, or a single store cutting out a middleman distributor for its bakery flour, controlling one more link of the supply chain directly is one of the few reliable ways to claw back margin in a business where nearly everyone else in the chain is already fighting over the same thin slice of profit. Meet the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, better known simply as A&P. This wasn't some small regional chain that never understood the business. A&P was, for decades, the largest retailer of any kind in the United States, not just the largest grocery chain. At its peak in the 1940s, it controlled roughly 1/10 of all grocery spending in the entire country. It pioneered the self-service supermarket format that every grocery store in the world still uses today. It was, by every measure, the company that invented modern grocery retail as we know it. And yet, in December of 2010, A&P filed for bankruptcy. It restructured, emerged as a private company less than 2 years later, and seemed to have survived. Then, in July of 2015, less than 4 years after walking out of its first bankruptcy, it filed again. This time, there was no recovery. Stores were sold off piece by piece to competitors. Hundreds of locations closed. By the end of that year, a company with a 156-year history simply ceased to exist. So how does the company that literally invented the modern supermarket format end up liquidated, twice bankrupt, gone within 5 years? The answer isn't a single bad decision. It's the accumulation of a business model that worked perfectly in one era and became a liability in the next. A&P had built its entire empire on standardization, tight cost control, and heavy reliance on private label goods, strategies that were revolutionary in the early 20th century. But as the industry evolved around discount chains, warehouse clubs, and increasingly sophisticated regional competitors, the systems and labor agreements A&P had built decades earlier became rigid and expensive to unwind. The same operational discipline that built the empire made it nearly impossible to adapt once the ground shifted underneath it. The company that taught the entire industry how to run efficient stores eventually got out-efficiencyed by companies it had inspired. Keep that in mind. In an industry running on a 1 to 3% margin, being good at the business isn't enough. You have to keep being good at it forever while the ground under you keeps moving. So with all of that on the table, what does the actual math look like if you're the one signing the lease? Here's the optimistic scenario. You've built or purchased a well-located supermarket generating around $37 million in annual revenue, roughly in line with the national average. You run a disciplined operation, keep shrinkage under control near the low end of the industry range, keep your private label mix in that sweet spot of 35 to 40%, and your perimeter departments, produce, deli, bakery, and meat, are pulling their weight with strong margins. In a good year like this, you're looking at a net profit in the range of $600,000 to $800,000. And if you're running a larger, fully scaled operation generating $15 million or more in revenue, owner compensation between salary and profit distributions can range from $400,000 to well past $5 million annually for the most efficient, multi-store operators. Now here's the realistic scenario. Shrinkage creeps up toward the higher end of the range, say 2.5%. Driven by a rough patch of employee turnover and a spike in theft. A produce delivery gets delayed by a supply chain hiccup, and you lose a chunk of fresh inventory to spoilage before it ever hits the shelf. Inflation pushes wholesale prices up, and to protect your margin, you raise shelf prices, only to watch a meaningful slice of your price-sensitive customers drift toward a discount competitor down the road. Add a stretch of chronic understaffing that leads to empty shelves during your busiest hours. Run that same $37 million revenue store through this version of the year, and instead of $600,000 to $800,000 in profit, you could be looking at a loss, somewhere in the range of a few $100,000 in the red, even though revenue barely moved at all. The difference between a good year and a bad year in this business isn't measured in the millions the way it might be in oil drilling or shipping. It's measured in a single percentage point of shrinkage, a single percentage point of margin, a handful of decisions made correctly or incorrectly at the store level, week after week, for 52 weeks straight. That's the real secret behind the supermarket business. It looks like a business about buying and selling food.